Hello, good afternoon. Today we are very fortunate to have Professor Karthik Muralidharan, and this is a great reminder that I learned about Professor Muralidharan's work from Vineet Pandey, who's one of the PhD students in design lab. And so this is a great time. I wanted to remind everybody today that if you know cool design relevant folks on campus, please let any of us know. Because a lot of the speakers that we get for this seminar are people that where suggestions come to us from all around campus, because there's a lot of design thinking relevant stuff happening everywhere, and it's really fun to see that disciplinary diversity. Karthik was born and raised in India. He got his AD in economics from Harvard. Then he went across the pond to Cambridge for a master's, and came back to Boston for a PhD in economics from Harvard. He's a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research and a number of other organizations. And he's going to talk to us about his work in development today. And Vineet mentioned to me as I was walking over here that the last time that he was in India, that Professor Muralidharan's work came up. They were like, oh yeah, he was over here last week just advising us on policy issues. And so this seems like a really great talk for design at large, because it's certainly at large scale in the world and in a good sense quite disruptive. So welcome, thank you.
Great. Is this on now? Yep, all good. So thanks so much, and this is quite a foray into the unknown for me. I think it's the first time I'm kind of talking to a group of computer scientists and folks with the theme of design, and I'm very excited because I think while what I'm presenting for the most part is like a straight out economics research paper that'll give you kind of an insight into how people are doing research in development economics in developing countries, this is probably the project of mine that has like a lot of scope for people in CS and design to start thinking about like implications going forward. Okay, so just since I believe this is the first time you've had an economist and me and address this group, I thought it'd be useful to just talk about economists as designers and the places where in society where economists get involved. So a lot of pretty much all economic transactions take place in markets, but markets are not things that happen completely magically organically. Almost every market that we have functions under some kind of design, some kind of regulation, some kind of information. So just to give you a setting, a sense of example, everything we do, like competition and regulation policy, right? I mean, what the FTC does is fundamentally a question of design. Credentials and standards, what the FDA does. When you have occupational licensing, when you have asymmetry of information, you have economists really coming and thinking about the costs and benefits of imposing certain restrictions versus relaxing that, okay? So these are fundamentally design questions. And where the economists get in is to say, can we empirically quantify the costs and benefits of going one way or the other and come back and offer some guidelines for policy, right? And some of the most exciting work in the past decade has been, the design issues involved in allocation through non-market mechanisms. So how do you allocate kidneys? Because we don't allow people to buy and sell kidneys, but there's still kind of a huge waiting list, and there is a supply that shows up sporadically, right? How do you optimally match residencies across residences in the US? How do you do school choice allocations? So this is the kind of work that Al Roth, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago, and his co-authors have been doing, and so that's just economists as market designers, right? And then there's a lot of work that economists do in program design, and I think one key way of thinking about the difference between economists and engineers is engineers are often kind of identifying constraints and solving problems, whereas economists do that and then add one more layer of complexity, which is thinking about strategic responses by other agents, okay? So there's this old kind of Bruce Lee movie, from the 60s, where I think his opponent tries to show how strong he is by holding up a wooden board, and breaking it, and kind of Bruce Lee's reaction is, boards don't hit back. Okay, so and I think that's one way of thinking about how economists have to deal with the world, which is you can come in and saying, hey, here's my solution, but you've then got to think about a bunch of re-optimizing agents, who might come back and completely subvert whatever intervention you were trying to do. Okay, so I can give you examples of how you can design programs to say performance pay, which sound perfectly sensible, but then they backfire. And then like a big part of what economists have spent time doing is also doing evaluation design, which is, when you roll out programs, you also want to be thinking about how do you infer the impacts, how do you figure out cost effectiveness, how do you go back and advise policymakers in a world of finite resources. And just like, for those of you who don't know, I mean, we've got an extremely strong group of development economists here at UCSD. This is a group that frankly didn't exist even 10 years ago, and we've kind of built up in the most recent round to be like in the top 10 US news, so which is something we're all extremely excited about. And I think part of what makes the group effective is there's faculty across economics, RADI, GPS, and a lot of us work closely together. We run seminars together, workshops together, advise students together. And there is this thing called explicitly the Policy Design and Evaluation Lab, which many of you may or may not be aware of, that sits in GPS but has faculty from all of these schools trying to make it work. Okay, so what is the specific project I'm going to talk about today? It's a project that is directly related to technology in particular, and development and education, and so something that touches all our lives a lot. So I've kind of, I've done a lot of work in the economics of education. So I'm broadly a public finance economist, and so most of my work focuses on effectiveness of public spending in the social sector and education and health and anti-poverty programs. And so if you kind of look at what we've learned in education research in the past 15 years, the glass half full story is that we've managed to get enrollment up in most developing countries to the point where most developing countries have close to 95 to 100% enrollment. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is that learning outcomes are absolutely abysmal. So, you have a country like India where about 60% of kids who complete primary school are not functionally literate at a second grade level. Okay, so, and people who people in the US who hear me present this saying, like, how can this be true? Like, I mean, we thought you have the most amazing kind of science and technology education system, right? You have the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, the chancellor of UCSD, right? Like, so these guys all came from the Indian education system. But the way you want to think about the Indian education system is it's not really an education system, but a high quality filtration system, okay? So essentially, if you manage to select the top 0.01% of a billion person distribution, those kids are going to do fantastic things even if you put them in a circus, okay? And so the fundamental challenge for the education system at scale is how do you kind of translate all of this spending of both resources and time into better learning outcomes, okay? So this, but this is a problem not just for India. This is a problem even for developed countries. So we don't have such good estimates of productivity in education, but for the most part, the estimates suggest that productivity growth in education lags every other sector in the economy, okay? So if you look at cost inflation, in general, education and health, like the cost increases fast outpace the rest of the economy, and that's partly because what you're seeing in the rest of the economy is much faster productivity growth, which brings down cost in a way that doesn't happen in health and education. And even like health is not so bad because the careful health economists have looked at health expenditure, because expenditure comprises both prices and quantities, okay? So most of what's going on in health is that we're doing more because we have new technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago. But education has fundamentally not changed in 100 years. I mean, what you still have is kind of the sage on a stage model, like, I mean, and you chalk and talk and you have one person, and that model has not scaled or fundamentally changed in about 100 years, okay? So it's not surprising, therefore, that most of people in Silicon Valley, like, think that technology is going to save us, okay? Like, I mean, and that this is going to be disruptive. And, there's very good and compelling reasons for thinking this, okay? So if you think about the mechanics by which technology might improve education, you could use this to consistently deliver high quality instruction, right? So you abstract away from the variation in teacher quality and teacher knowledge, you get high quality content, that's going to be good. You can improve student attention through engagement and more interactive pedagogy. You could personalize the learning to where the students are. I mean, anybody who's been a professor knows that the hardest thing to manage is how do I handle variation in a classroom, okay? So that's going to be very promising. And you can sharply reduce the feedback loop for students between doing something and kind of getting the feedback of whether you've done this right or wrong, okay? So all of this would theoretically suggest that technology should be able to have a big impact on education. Till you go look at the evidence, right? And unfortunately, this, as many other highly hyped up cases, is a case where the marketing is much ahead of the substance, okay? So if you look at this recent handbook chapter in the Handbook of Economics of Education that, summarizes high quality evidence, the punchline is that you get mixed evidence with a pattern of null results, okay? So for the most part, you have estimates that basically give you zero impacts, like on learning outcomes, some that are negative, some that are positive, okay? So And in particular, I think what's worth highlighting is these very high-profile programs, like one laptop per child, okay, with very high-profile evangelists, Media Lab, Nick Negroponte, going around the world and saying, get the laptop, save your kids, so, and that's where kind of, unfortunately, the economists come in and try to bring some reality to the hype. And when you do a high-quality randomized controlled trial of this in Peru, where they literally gave every kid a computer, the IDB convinced them to randomize the rollout, so you got a good control group, right? So that's a big part of what we do as economists. And they basically found zero impact, okay, on learning. And so what that suggests is, theoretically there's going to be a fair bit of promise, but we need a lot more attention, and particularly to the details of design. And I think that's kind of why this is an appropriate topic for today's seminar, because I think this is one of these classic cases where it makes a big difference to pay attention to what the binding constraint is in the status quo and how your intervention is going to come and alleviate that, okay? So what we're doing in today's paper is presenting evidence on one such program in India. And the real hero are these guys, not us, okay? So this is a program called Mindspark, developed by this company called Education Initiatives. But the key is they've done this over 10 years, okay? And unlike being like technologists who have come to education thinking they're going to save education, these are educators who've come to technology, saying how do we use technology to improve productivity in functions that we know are important as educators, okay? So I'll tell you a bit more about the details of the program later, but I think the key things you need to know is that over this 10 years, they have a 45,000 question item bank that have been used by close to 500,000 kids, and they administer over 1 million questions a day, okay? So this is like big data fantasy land, for many of you guys, right? So I'm hoping excite and create some ideas here, okay? But what they're able to do with all of this is they can benchmark these questions very finely, to the curriculum, and also use student responses to precisely figure out where you are and where you're stuck, and kind of customize content, for each student that's independent of the curriculum, okay? And the software itself is kind of highly scalable. It's platform agnostic. It can be deployed in schools, in the internet, after-school models. And so what we did in this project is we evaluated the after-school model, which are what are called Mindspark centers. So basically, as with any product development cycle, so this is not like Khan Academy that was funded by millions of upfront philanthropic money, right? This was a for-profit company that had to pay the bills, and so as happens with any product development cycle, they were kind of targeted at the high end of the market, okay? So they first went after people who could afford to pay, and that's still kind of what keeps the bills, keeps the bills paid. But the founders, who had a strong commitment to education for over 15 years, were quite keen to make the product available to low-income environments, okay? So what they did was they got philanthropic funding to basically set up these after-school centers in low-income communities in Delhi, okay? So these centers are, I'll show you a picture, it's basically just like a room with computers where kids go there after school, and you have an instruction program, okay? So it's about 90 minutes of instruction 6 days a week, so that's what you're getting. And what we're doing is, a big part of economics in the past 15 years, as I was just telling Ramesh before we started, is a lot of econometrics for the last 30, 40 years has been about how do you torture the truth out of non-experimental data, okay? Because the world doesn't give you experiments. Everything changes at the same time, okay? So when you say, oh, these economists can't predict what's going to happen in the economy, it's because there's too much going on at the same time. It's like, asking you to predict the weather 3 months out, okay? It's just as hard, okay? But what we've been doing is, over the past 15 years, an increasing kind of focus on well-identified causal relationships is trying to bring the rigor of clinical trials and medical research, into economic research by saying that, hey, in most developing country settings, when you have big new fancy policies and programs, you're not going to be able to scale this up overnight anyway, okay? So you're going to need to phase it out, and as you phase it out, if you randomize, you can create a statistically valid control group, and then any differences you pick up after that are going to be attributable to this, okay? So that's kind of like a 2-minute primer on what experimental or randomized controlled trials in economics look like, but that's what I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to be presenting based on a randomized experiment with about 619 kids, and it's going to be about 5 months of program exposure, okay? Now, the tradition in economic seminars is to actually present the results quickly, so it's not like one of these mystery novels. It's like more like this is the result, and then the rest is going to be why you should believe me, as opposed to, the other way around. And so in terms of summarizing the results, there's even before we get to the experiment, I think one of the really cool things about this kind of computer-aided learning is you get a much more granular understanding of learning levels than you get with paper and pencil tests, okay? So one of the problems with paper and pencil tests is because I have a finite amount of time in what I can test you, if most of my kids in, say, grade 7, like, will score 0, I have no idea how far below grade 7 they are, okay? So whereas with like a dynamic adaptive test, you get to exactly pinpoint the level of learning of a kid, okay? So what that's going to let us do is kind of characterize not just the levels, but the distribution of learning of every kid in a classroom, which we've not seen in any education studies so far anywhere in the world, because that level of granular data just doesn't exist, okay? So what you're going to see is that the students in the setting, so the focus is on middle school kids, about grade 6 to 9. And I know I talk fast, okay? So there's a lot going on, but stop me if there's clarifying questions, all right? So students in the setting are several grade levels below their standard, and this gap is going to grow with age, okay? So I'm going to show you a very striking picture. And what you're going to see is that in the control group, right, the kids who are in the bottom third basically learn nothing from spending time in school. So this goes back to this narrative I told you about selection as opposed to teaching, right? Because essentially, once you've missed the bus, if what's going on in class is 4 grades above you, like, it doesn't matter where you are, you're just not learning anything, okay? So, and that may be like the leading candidate for why all the increased spending is not having any impact on learning outcomes, because you're not alleviating a binding constraint, okay? And I'll give you more examples of that, okay? Now, and what we see is the offer of this Mindspark voucher, okay, which is, I'll explain that, but basically it's being given access to the program, okay? So it's randomized and you get access to the program, and you get these very large increases. So everything in education research we report in standard deviations, because reporting, say, percentage of test score gains makes no sense without knowing how easy or difficult the test is, right? So normally we just we normalize, we standardize the control distribution, and then everything is relative to the distribution of the control group. So 0.36 standard deviations on a normal is going to be somewhere between 12 and 14 percentile points, right? So it's like taking a kid at a median and moving them about 14 percentile points in about 4.5 months. So those are humongous effects, okay? So just to give you some perspective, you know, I've been working in education research for about 15 years, and the largest effects I've found, like, I mean, from an earlier study, the gains we got in 5 years, we're getting here in 5 months, okay? So it's about 10 times bigger in terms of productivity per unit of time than anything I've seen so far in all the work we've done, okay? So, and then the other set of results in terms of heterogeneity across students are that, consistent with the promise of customized instruction, you're going to see similar gains for kids at all parts of the distribution, okay? So everybody gains a comparable amount. But the relative gains are much, much bigger for the weakest kids, and that's because the weakest kids were learning nothing sitting in their regular classroom, okay? So from an equity perspective, this is going to be quite nice. And then there's a bunch of other results, like, you know, which I'll show you, all right? So in terms of placing this in the broader literature, I think there's 3 broad literatures we contribute to, I think. So the first is there is this huge literature in technology and education. A lot of this work is not very good, okay? And the problem is that, unfortunately, it's kind of a scandal if you look at how, say, school districts in the US, like, I mean, pick their technologies. It's mostly just based on marketing, right? Like, I mean, nobody has any real evidence, like, I mean, to kind of bring to bear in these procurement problems. It's like, who has the nicest presentation, who has the, you know, smoothest looking gizmos. So the problem is that, A, there's a lot more stuff out there than has been evaluated, and what has been evaluated, the effects are quite pessimistic. But when we look at this, so Appendix B of this paper has like an 8-page lit review of our own, where we kind of create our own taxonomy of the existing work, and what we see is a pretty clear pattern, okay? The pattern is that interventions that just give you hardware, for the most part, have 0 impact, okay? So, and in some cases even negative. So there's studies in, say, Romania that give teenagers free computers, and of course they're playing games and their test scores get worse, okay? So it's like, so the next political leader who says, let's give everybody a laptop, right? I mean, chances are it's going to give you bad outcomes, okay? So now, as you might imagine, like, the key to effective use of technology in education is going to be the extent to which the technology is integrated with pedagogy, okay? So there are a series of studies, both in the US and then a bunch of them in China, that typically find modest positive effects of CAL programs. So CAL is just computer-aided learning, right? That focus on grade-appropriate instruction, okay? So you're 9th grade, you've done a bunch of stuff in school, you go home, or you're in the computer lab afterwards, and then you're kind of reinforcing this material, okay? So, and so there you typically find modest positive effects, okay? But the problem is that in most of these cases, the teachers and the principals want the content to reinforce what's being done in school, okay? So you're pretty much locked to reviewing grade appropriate content because they want to reinforce that, okay? So, but if you look at the one other study that's found big effects like ours, that's also a study that allows customization, beyond the range of what is curricularly appropriate, okay? So now I'm not experimentally varying the customization, so I don't want to kind of go too far in making that claim. But this is just in my taxonomy. When I look at the results and try to make sense of why they're all over the place, this is the pattern that seems to make sense.
So do you think that education is worse than other fields in terms of the gap between the cutting edge research labs and what gets rolled out? You know, because if you look at, I mean, there certainly are some learning sciences groups that have done some nice work, and that stuff never shows up in the one laptop per child. And so if you look at the deployments, the situation's really grim. Whereas if you look at kind of the leading edge insights, there's actually some good ideas.
No, that's absolutely right? And I think, on Friday, I'm giving another talk on campus on experimentation at scale, where I'm going to be talking about exactly some of these issues. So I think, and when I finish, I mean, even for this study, right, I mean, 619 kids as an RCT is bigger than most things I've seen, but that is still a rounding error for a country like India, right? I mean, so we're kind of barely beginning. So the next step is actually now embedding this in schools and doing a next stage experimental trial with about 10,000 kids in about 50 schools, right? So there is kind of a stepwise agenda where you kind of keep trying to circumvent the implementation issues that will show up in larger samples and also in more representative implementation environments. I think the problem, so hold that thought because that's going to be my last slide, okay? All right. And then, like I said, in developing country education, so some of the most striking examples, right, of resources that we think should matter but have no impact. So we've now seen 4 or 5 high-quality randomized controlled trials of giving kids free textbooks, right, books, reading materials, 0 impact. Now, why is that? It's basically because if you look at the data, the top 20% of kids in the baseline test scores will benefit, but the average kid cannot read. Okay, but it kind of highlights, why there's such a big cognitive disconnect, between discourses of the elite and discourses of, what's actually going on, right? So I'm convinced that most well-intentioned policies that don't work are because the policymakers who are elites kind of project the constraints that they are exposed to, onto the average population, and nobody's giving them representative data, okay? So, we've got this paper in Tanzania. Same thing, right? We doubled the per child spending in schools, non-teacher salary spending. They spend it in books, big fat 0, okay? But you can see how you'll have this motivated aid worker who goes to a Tanzanian school and says, hey, there's 11 kids sharing one textbook. How can they possibly learn, okay? So highly motivated aid worker, highly motivated government official comes back and writes an aid memoir saying that, we need textbooks to improve learning. And then there'll be an enormous amount of attention paid to the logistics, the procurement, the delivery, making sure the books didn't get stolen. But at best what you'll have is a culture of audit as opposed to a culture of impact evaluation, right? So when you do the impacts, you basically find there's nothing. And the leading candidate is that this mismatch between student preparation and what the curriculum is doing, in which case you're not alleviating a binding constraint, okay? So there's now, I think a lot of us who've been working in this area have been kind of pushing for this idea of teaching at the right level. And so Esther and Abhijit, who are the world's probably 2 most well-known development economists, the authors of Poor Economics, right? They've been pushing this in a big way in primary schools, okay? And it's possible in primary schools to effectively do some kind of segmentation and coaching kids. But as you get to secondary school and the content gets more complex, it's not possible to even do that by physical tracking, okay? So at some point, the technology becomes the key to being able to scale that idea of individualization and customization. Okay? And then the last part is, again, I'm cramming a lot of different courses in each bullet point, right? So, but if you read Angus Deaton, so Deaton who won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years ago, so he's got this famous work of what are called the Preston curves. And in the Preston curves, he basically shows that today's developing countries have much higher life expectancy than today's developed countries had at the same level of per capita income, okay? And why is that? It's because it didn't matter how rich you were 100 years ago. If you got polio, there was no vaccine. We didn't know what to do about it, right? So there's been a lot more technology, that has kind of developed at the cutting edge and diffuses at lower income, right? But we haven't seen that in education. And so these technologies could allow countries to leapfrog, and we've got examples in many, many sectors of how technology enables such leapfrogging. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture here, and there's a lot, I'll go through this pretty quickly because a lot of this is just pictures, but hopefully, yeah. Am I too fast, or is this fine? This is good at the back? But also, remember there's variation in the classroom, right? Like, I can't be teaching to the top, right? So, all right, so here are the key features of the program. I've already talked about the high quality content. And again, these are not a bunch of learning scientists. These are not they don't have PhDs on staff. But they do read the research and they try to incorporate what seems to be well known in the design. So for example, with teaching language to illiterate and first generation learners, one of the most effective techniques in the past 15 years has been this idea of what's called same language subtitling. So this was done by a professor at IIM Ahmedabad. And the idea was, how do you teach hundreds of millions of adults who are completely illiterate? I mean, how do you teach them to read when they don't have time for school, okay? And the technique that he stumbled upon was basically karaoke, right? Which is that everybody knows their Bollywood songs, okay? You play a song, everybody knows the songs, everybody sees the movies, okay? So what he did was he just experimented with, when the song was playing, having the text kind of go along the screen in what's called same language subtitling, right? So you hear it, you see the text, you see a bolding character by character as it's flashing in front of you, and you're kind of simultaneously engaging the visual and the audio and the cognitive parts of the brain, and that seems to make a much bigger impact than sitting adults in a classroom and mechanically going through words, okay? So, and that kind of idea is embedded in the content over here in terms of how they teach language, okay? So they're not doing micro RCTs on each component, but they're trying to reflect some of the research. There's adaptive instruction, which I've already talked about. And then the thing that I get the most excited about long-term, again, as a area for machine learning and big data, is this idea that not only do you customize based on levels, but that you can use this data to analyze patterns of errors and understand exactly where students are stuck, okay? So this is a very old idea in education. So you go all the way back to Piaget, and you'll hear quotes that saying, a good teacher learns more from a student's mistakes than from seeing what the student gets correct. Okay? Because it's when you see the mistake that you then question further and saying, why did you get this wrong? What were you thinking? Sometimes, were you thinking? Okay, so, and you get that, but this is really, really difficult to do, okay, in small samples. So I'm going to give you an example of just, one example of this, and this is really rudimentary, right? So, all right, so this is what the after-school centers look like, okay? So you've got about 25 kids, each with their own computer, with their own headphones, and they're pretty much functioning independently. There's wide variation of age and grades. There is kind of this one adult in the room who's mainly kind of ensuring adherence and solving technical issues, but not really teaching, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So, but here's what I want to spend some time on, okay? So this is an example of using technology not just to identify the level of learning, but to identify the precise nature of the misunderstanding, okay? So imagine a regular teacher in a classroom teaching kids fractions or decimals, okay? So even in the best situation, what's going to happen is the teacher's going to teach something, pass out a test. If you get 80% and above, they're like, great, good job, right? If you're between 50 and 80, they're at, all right, practice a bit more. And if you're under 50%, the teacher might say, all right, let's go over the whole concept again. Okay, that's the best they can possibly do. But it might be the case that 5 different kids who have 60% are losing 40% for completely different reasons. And that's not going to be possible for a teacher to humanly figure out. Okay? So this is what I get excited. Though this is not experimental. Okay? So here's an example of when they're starting to teach decimals, they'll give you 30 comparisons, decimal comparisons. And based on analyzing that data, you get a customized pathway of instruction, based on what kind of conceptual errors you seem to have. Okay, so here's then a simple example, okay? So look at this, and if kids are comparing 3.27 versus 3.3, okay, you'll get a bunch of them that say this is bigger. Okay, so why do they think this? It's because they're basically looking at everything after the decimal and saying 27 is bigger than 3, right? So the fact that there's a kind of a 0 here is not obvious, okay? So that's obvious. Now this one gets trickier. Why might they say 3.18 is bigger? Now it can't be this because 27 is bigger than 18. Exactly, right? So, but why might they do that? It's because Exactly, right? They're exhibiting what's called reverse order thinking, right? But specifically, when you ask the kids, it's essentially that they understand that 100 is bigger than 10, and so they think 100th is bigger than 10th, right? So the idea that the 110, that ordering reverses on either side of the decimal, like, that's where they have gotten stuck. Now the last one is even more fun, okay? Why might they think that 3.27 is bigger? Okay? It can't be this, because 27 is smaller than 39. It can't be this, because 9 is bigger than 7, right? But they're picking this one. Okay? So this one is like so deep that you think, really? Kids think this way? Okay, but it turns out that there must have been like some teacher at some point who mentioned that think about what comes after the decimal as a fraction. And I've done this with my son when I teach him, right? Like, well, what's after the decimal is a fraction. So, but if you think that what's after the decimal is a fraction, what they're then doing is inverting. Right, no, they're basically comparing 1 over 27 with 1 over 39. Right? So that's kind of what they call reciprocal thinking. Okay, now all of this might seem very far-fetched, and indeed it is, because the fraction of kids who make each of these mistakes is quite small. Okay? So there's only 5% who are doing this, 4 who are doing this, 3 who are doing this. So if you think about a class of 30 kids, I mean, you can't distinguish this from statistical noise. But when you have millions of observations and kind of generate these patterns, and then you see how the kids' responses are mapping into your master database, that lets you diagnose, and then that taxonomy allows you to categorize kids, gets everything right or wrong, right? There's whole number thinking, column overflow thinking, reverse thinking, denominator. So they've got this classification based on which, like, I mean, you then get specific questions. Now, I wouldn't spend so much time on this in an economics talk, but this is design, so, like, you know, I mean, I thought you'd enjoy that level of detail. Okay? All right. So what did we do here? We just conduct a very simple experimental evaluation of these Mindspark centers. Question?
A quick question. So does that system, going back to the previous slide, automatically generate these patterns?
No, exactly. So that's why, you know, I think about this as big data 1.0. Like, I mean, this is kind of still extremely primitive, right? So their system is much more one where they look at the patterns and the teachers look at it, and then they'll go interview a sample of kids, okay? So it's still very, very mechanical and human interface heavy, right? They're very far from doing true machine learning, like, I mean, of saying, use the data to kind of trawl the design space and come up with ideas that even the teachers may not have thought of, and then to test that, okay? So I'll talk about that at the end, which is where some of this is going forward, okay? All right, so then here's, you know, I think the evaluation design is like a very simple randomized controlled trial, okay? So the way this works with any of these kind of programs is because the Mindspark centers charge a fee, right? So even though it was subsidized by philanthropists, they wanted to make sure that parents valued this, so they charged a modest fee, right? And so all we did was we basically recruited a bunch of kids and saying that we have some philanthropic money for this to be made free, okay? And we're going to give that out by lottery. And then for those of you who don't win it this round, like, as long as you stay in the study, there's a chance that you'll get it the next time, okay? So that's kind of how you keep the attrition down and you keep your experimental sample, okay? So it's pretty standard experimental design, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, okay? So, all right, and then in terms of the data, and this is also just giving you a glimpse of what field experimental research and development economics looks like. So, you know, which is why most of my RAs and postdocs are sitting in India, not here. Like, you know, so we run a global operation. But, you know, what we have is we have our own primary field data collection. And the testing is all based on paper and pencil tests, okay? Because if I'm measuring based on the computer, then I'm confounding familiarity with the platform, like, I mean, with the test score results, okay? So everything we measure is coming from independent paper and pencil tests, and that's what I'm reporting. So I will only use the computer system data for analyzing the patterns, but not for the research results, okay? So that's going to come from paper and pencil, okay? And there's a lot of work on test design and psychometrics, which I'm going to skip, okay? Yeah, and then for the lottery winners, we have data from the system on the take-up and attendance of that initial assessment and detailed question-wise data. So we're just kind of, I mean, let me put it this way. I don't think I've ever written an 87-page paper with like a sample as small as 619 kids, but it gives you like a sense of how much data there is, right, even from a relatively small experiment compared to some of the other things I've done. Okay, so this is then the magic of a nice randomized controlled trial. Like, I mean, you basically have identical kind of composition and everything across treatment. That's the treatment group, that's the control group. The differences are essentially 0, and all of those are insignificant, okay? So that's kind of what lets you then infer any difference as coming from that, okay? Now, this is a picture about external validity. So just the basic statistical concepts, right? Internal validities are my causal estimates valid within the sample I study, right? External validities, how does that generalize to the broader population, right? And so given that I have a self-selected study sample that chose to we're interested enough to show up, it's still randomized within that, okay? The question is, does the result extrapolate to the general population, okay? So here we're just showing you that the test scores of the kids in the study and non-study are pretty similar, so you've got common support across the whole distribution, okay? All right, so the nice thing with a simple design is the pictures. Most of what I have is pictures, okay? So I find this like one of the most striking pictures in this whole project. That has nothing to do with the experiment, okay? So this is simply coming from the descriptive data on day 1, okay? So basically we've done the randomization, and on day 1 we've got the treatment kids who are assessed on the platform, okay? And this is what this picture is telling you, is this is the grade the kids are enrolled in. Now, if the kids were at a grade appropriate level, they would be here. So that is what a curricular appropriate rate of progress would look like, okay? And what you see is in 6th grade, like your typical kid is already 2.5 grade levels behind in math. And that gap is growing over time, and by the time you get to grade 9, that's a 4.5-year level gap. Now, the important caveat here is suddenly you're thinking, wait, where's Pradeep Khosla here? Okay, and he's not here, right? Because these are the public schools, right? So the top third of the distribution are in private schools, which is where you get the preparation, to pass these high-stakes exams that then get you into the IITs, right? Which is where he's from. Sorry, when you have a local example, you have to make use of it, right? Okay? So, but if you look at what's going on with your typical public school situation in India, this is probably an overestimate because this is public schools in Delhi as opposed to rural Bihar. Okay? And notice the other thing I talked about, which is each dot here is one kid. Okay? So this is characterizing the variation in a classroom. So if you look at basically kids enrolled in grade 8, you've got some kids all the way up here, and you've got other down here at the 2nd grade level. So if you're a teacher, imagine you're an 8th grade teacher and you're dealing with some kids at a 2nd grade level, some at a 3rd, some at a 4th, some at a 5th. What do you humanly do? Right? So some of my work has focused on governance issues in education. I've done a lot of work on teacher absenteeism and accountability problems. But now you flip that around and think about the highly motivated teacher who shows up. And the best that this teacher can do is complete the textbook. But that's going to leave behind the vast majority of the kids. Okay, so I've scattered this around because the system classifies you at integer level, so it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that's kind of just the mass, right? So you can draw a distribution around, and that's going to be centered here.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by ability here? In the sense, is it possible for a 6th grader to get an ability level of 7?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the ability is just the psychometric term for what is the grade level at which you're testing. It's just what's the level. It's not like some raw innate ability that is immutable. That's just the psychometric term. So in fact, this should just say assess grade level of current test scores, right? Is what that should. So ability is the psychometric term, but that can be a little confusing. So ability is not immutable. It's just at what level of learning you are. No, so this is coming from calibrating that item bank of 45,000 questions to the syllabus, right? So, and that's kind of why this kind of calibration exercise is much better for math than language, because in math, if you look at the textbook and the syllabus, there's a very clear mapping of kind of a lexicographic ordering of subjects. So you know that this concept will only be introduced in grade 5 after this concept has been covered, right? So it's much easier to take every question in the math syllabus and map it to a specific grade. And so the way the psychometrics works is just that we have a body of questions, and then based on the student's pattern of answers, you kind of just estimate a simple maximum likelihood of what is the theta that maximizes the probability of that particular pattern of answers. So that's how your SAT and GRE scores all work, right? But this calibration is coming from taking those 45,000 questions and putting it on a curricular referenced benchmark, and that's where it's coming from. So this is not an individual teacher's opinion. This is what the item bank of 45,000 questions is doing for you. Okay, so in some ways this is like almost like the most striking picture.
Are you going to talk about the Hindi?
Yeah, so the Hindi, the patterns are similar, but what ends up happening is in Hindi, you kind of see that there's a lot more fluidity, like in the categorization of what's grade appropriate. So because it's just that the stories get a little bit more complex, the sentences get a little longer, right? So there isn't like such a clear taxonomy, like, but in math it's much cleaner. But the broad pattern is the same. So there's this trick I normally do, and I'm wondering if I should do this. या ठीक है मैं करता हूँ. तो अभी मैं अगर इस लेक्चर के बीच में हिंदी में बात करने लगा तो हाथ उठाइए कितने लोगों को समझ में आ रहा है. ठीक है. अरे ये तो मतलब काफ़ी अभी देखिए तो मैं क्वालिफाइड प्रोफेसर हूँ, बड़ा मोटिवेटेड हूँ, एब्सेंट भी नहीं हूँ, आके पढ़ा रहा हूँ, आई कांटेक्ट कर रहा हूँ, सबको पढ़ा रहा हूँ, फिर भी कुछ क्लास में लगभग 1/3 बच्चों को समझ में आ रहा है ना. तो आप लोग जो समझ नहीं पा रहे हैं मेरे को, अभी 1 सेकंड में 1 मिनट के लिए आपको महसूस हो रहा है कि टिपिकल इंडियन स्कूल में बच्चे को रोज क्या फीलिंग होता है. இப்போ நான் தமிழ்லையும் பேசலாம். ஸோ இப்போ இந்த ஹிந்தி புரியவா அவளுக்கும் வந்து லைக் இன்னும் புரியாது. ஸோ தமிழ் பேசுகிறவா எவ்வளோ இருக்கா? 2 பேர். So now we'll
feel like if we don't speak alive, that's how we feel in school. Exactly. It's like, yeah, I got that part too late.
That was the point, right? So you've just spent 30 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in a developing country, right? And so then when you hear people talk about education and saying, oh, kids are dropping out, it's not because parents are kind of getting kids to drop out to go for child labor. It's because being in school for year after year, day after day, year after year, and not learning anything is just absolutely miserable. But that's the point, again, of having a filtration system, right? It's kind of essentially sorting out kids who are not smart. Right? So I would say the existential challenge for education systems around the world, and particularly developing countries, is how do you move from kind of a screening paradigm to a developmental paradigm where you're able to teach everybody regardless of where they are. Okay? So if you don't remember anything, remember those 30 seconds. Okay? And kind of the numb feeling of stupidness, that you feel, particularly because there's some smart kids in the class who get it, right? And they're laughing, and then you feel, oh man, this is really not for me. Okay, so that's what's going on. All right, so this is then, I'm going back to the control group and just showing you with data what I kind of alluded to earlier, which is I'm looking at the absolute value added, which is how much are these kids learning from the time they've spent in school. And at the bottom third, you see there's basically nothing, right? So the bottom third of the kids are making no progress, and that's because that's all of you who came to class day after day and had to hear the professor lecture in Hindi. Okay, that's that group. Okay, well, literally, here it's 2/3, right? That's Hindi. Okay? And so now you can see why this CAL is going to be such a big deal in a setting like this. Okay, so here's then the core result, which is what you see is this huge increase in math in just 4.5 months. It's about like a doubling in math and even bigger in Hindi. So I'll just do this. So the way to read the table is that's the treatment effect, so it's the top line you care about, right? So the estimating equation is just everything else is constant. We're just looking at how much bigger your outcomes are if you're in the treatment group, okay? And if you look at the constant, this is telling you the absolute progress made by the control group in this time. And so if you look at this, you see that you're basically doubling the value added from 4.5 months of exposure relative to the control group, okay? And in Hindi, it's like a factor of 2.5. So that's 2.5x of the learning that's happening. And this is already an upper bound of the productivity in the schooling system, right? Because this is the control group that's not just going to school, but also has private tuition and parental inputs and all of that stuff, right? So this is the total gain that happened in the control group in that period of time. And so it's an upper bound of what you could be getting from the school. Okay? Whereas the only difference here in the treatment is those kids have gone for the Mindspark program. Okay? All right. So this I'm going to skip, but since standard deviations sometimes are hard to kind of feel and grasp, I'm just breaking this down by kind of different types of questions and showing you what percentage got it right in the control group and how much higher the treatment group does in every one of these things, okay? Now, one huge caveat, you might look at these numbers and saying, hey, the control group is not doing that bad, and that's because our test construction had to basically be centered at about 2 or 3 grade levels below so that you wouldn't have a bunch of zeros, okay? So that's why the absolute number doesn't have much meaning, because it's so sensitive to what the difficulty level of the test is, right? So this is designed to maximize discrimination, but not to be an absolute statement of learning. Yeah. Oh, the treatment is attending these Mindspark centers, right? Like for 4.5 months. So that computer lab I showed you, yeah. So it's from this personalized computer-aided instruction for about 4.5 months, right? So the experiment ran from about November 2015 till about March 2016, right? So yeah, this is why I needed the clicker, see? I pace a lot. Okay, so this is just doing this for language. Okay, so let's look at heterogeneity, and this is, again, a very powerful picture. So what we're doing here is we're ordering the kids by the percentile in the baseline test, okay? So from the lowest scoring kid to the highest scoring kid on the baseline. And then I'm just showing you at the end line, this is the control distribution, right? So obviously kids with low scores have lower, so this is pretty monotonic. But the treatment kind of pretty much sits all the way above this. And you see those gains are kind of similar at all parts of the distribution, right? And these are very tight standard errors. So at every percentile, this is kind of significantly above this. Okay? And you see the same for Hindi. So this is what I said, that in absolute terms, you get constant effects. But now I'm overlaying this over that earlier picture, and you see that in relative terms, this is a much bigger deal for the weakest kids. Okay? And why is that? I'm going to show you next. And that's because, now I'm not experimentally isolating personalization, but because we observe every question faced by every kid every day, I can show you, right? So this is the variation we documented, and I can show you exactly what the system is feeding you. Okay? So this is on one single day on the 3rd of November, okay? And what you see is this is the math level assessed by the platform, and this is the level of the content it's giving you. Right? So if you're assessed at a grade 2 level, it's basically giving you material between grade 2 and 3. Right? So based on where you're assessed, it's giving you grade appropriate stuff. And so again, think about a teacher and how a teacher could humanly, at the same time, provide content to like 25 kids at 6 different grade levels. Not going to happen.
All these students had a basic literacy level where they could read all the questions.
Good question, right? So in fact, my prior earlier was that this kind of platform can only be used for middle school, like and not for primary school, that you need functional literacy and numeracy to even use the platform. Now, we didn't test this because our experiment was focused on 6 to 9, but talking to EI, they think this is just as effective in the younger grades for the reasons I told you, right? So the way they teach literacy is you will have the headphone, you will have an animated story playing, okay? So you will see the animation, you will hear the story, and you will see the karaoke words. Okay? Then they'll play it a second time, but this time without the animation, right? So the animation helps you get the context of what's going on, right? Then you get the audio and the video, and then the third time they'll switch off the audio as well, so then you just focus on the reading, right? So they think that this is actually effective across the board, but we have not yet tested that. Okay? So then this is what this is showing you is just within the 4.5 months, we're showing you the progress made by kids at all parts of the distribution, okay? So what this is saying your typical 9th grade kid starts 4.5 grade levels behind, right? So this is grade 4 to grade 5, they're about here. And over about 4.5 months, they have basically gained about a full grade level in math. So the good news here is it looks like it is possible to teach. Right? So for those who think that kids are not getting it, cannot be taught, that's complete BS. Right? It's just that once you're so far behind, nobody has the patience to invest in teaching you at the right level. Okay? And the other thing is, I must be careful not to suggest that this is all personalization, right? This has all of the mechanisms I talked about. It is high quality content. It is engaging and interactive. It does shrink the feedback loop. Right? So one of the things EI does in terms of its instruction, they don't use videos as much, okay? And I see this even when I do Khan Academy with my son, because essentially after a few minutes, the eyes glaze over, right? So with the video, you can't actually test engagement. So the way they do this is like every problem is kind of broken down line by line by line. So like, I mean, you're forced to do the steps, even if it's boring, and they can even track time between keystrokes, right? So essentially the idea is you constantly try to engage as opposed to allowing disengagement, right? So when you think about, again, as economists, I started this whole thing motivating this in terms of productivity, right? So normally we think about productivity per dollar spent, but I think in education, I'm more interested in productivity per unit of time spent, okay? So most of the time kids spend in classrooms, half the time, today seems to be pretty good, but half the time, there's a lot of computers out there, right? I have no idea who's on Twitter, I have no idea, like, I mean, who's actually here, right? And so just getting that attention is going to increase productivity, yeah? So the gains are across the board. So this is, I'm going to skip this, okay? This is just highlighting, again, the design considerations. This is, now I'm talking about test design, okay? So one of the problems in education research is that the outcomes we tend to use, because it's expensive in most other settings to do your own tests, is we tend to use the school tests, okay? But here's the problem. If the content you're getting here is 4 grade levels below, you might not see any impact in the school test, right? And we can actually show that here, right? So here, I'm showing you in math, if you look at the 8th grade kid, the 8th grade kid is not getting any 8th grade content, right? Because they're all below that, right? So the content is basically, the modal content is about 2 or 3 grade levels below. Now in Hindi, that's not the case. In Hindi, kids are getting grade appropriate content, partly because of the way it's organized. And we can now test this in our data, right? Sorry, this is the Hindi part, where you see the grade appropriate content. And because we have our own tests that span a very broad range of difficulty, like I can break down the results by if the question is at or above grade level, there's no impact. But for questions below grade level, you see a significant positive impact. But in Hindi, you see it for both, which is consistent with the fact that the system in Hindi gave you grade appropriate content as well. Okay, so I think people are glazing over a little bit. Yeah, these are just technical issues of test construction, which I'm going to skip over. But this is the point about design. So if you're a parent, if you're looking at how your kid is doing in the school test, you're not going to be able to figure out, because there's no impact on any of the other subjects. But there is in Hindi, where you do see grade appropriate content. Right? So it kind of highlights why, like, say, simple market-based analogies, like, I mean, don't work so well for education. Right? I mean, I have a PhD in economics, and I have no idea what happens in my son's school. Right? And so you come back with some test scores, and you're making like some wild guess about what's going on. Okay? So these are places, like, I mean, where you need the research, because there isn't an effective market test for whether something is effective or not. Okay? Most design problems, you can just say, you can do an A/B test and saying, let's just see what the consumer clicks. You've got a market test. We don't have that. Education. Okay? So I'm going to skip this, because the effects I've given you so far are actually highly conservative, because remember, the kids have to go to these centers. So the attendance rate on average was only 58%. So this is just plotting the distribution of attendance. And so if you adjust, like, I mean, per day attended, that's where you get these much bigger effects of about 0.59 standard deviations and about 0.36. Okay? So that's from about 90 days of exposure. Okay? So I don't need to do more technical stuff. Okay, I'm going to skip the robustness. And cost effectiveness, again, so one kind of important interpretation issue here is, remember that this is an after-school program, okay? So I'm confounding both the technology with additional instructional time, right? So I have not yet isolated the effect of technology, because the control group didn't have, ideally they would have had extra instructional time. Okay, so what ideally I want to do is compare the Mindspark after-school program with other kinds of after-school private tuition. Okay? Now, and I couldn't have designed this better if I'd tried it, but we got incredibly lucky that there was a parallel study going on at the same time, like, I mean, by a professor at Cornell, like, I mean, who was actually a year junior to me in grad school, and they were studying like a private tuition program in Delhi. So it's literally uncanny. I couldn't have written this better myself to give us a comparison, right? It's 2 hours after school, 6 days a week, 200 rupee fee, which is the same fee run by a leading NGO, and they find zero impact on test scores. Okay, so what are the 2 big differences between their program and ours? The first is the technology, but the second is that this is grade appropriate instruction, right? Which in my mind is the leading explanation for why, like, I mean, that extra instructional time gave you very little impact. Because it's, again, it's like I forced you to come to, like, I mean, 5 lectures a week of me talking to you in Tamil.
How do they recruit the students?
So that's, I mean, it's a similar program, like, because a lot of parents, see, I think the difference there is this, right? I don't think they learned nothing. I think what they learned was kind of exam taking skills, right? Because what the parents want is to somehow get you to pass a test, okay? So, but on an independent test of learning, there was no impact. I suspect, like, if you just looked at the drilled questions from past year exams, there may have been an effect, okay? Because that's what the private tuition was doing, okay? All right, so I have 10 minutes and I want to leave time for discussion. So in terms of cost effectiveness, I think, it's always a problem doing cost effectiveness for products that have very high fixed cost of development and then very low marginal cost, right? But the way to think about this is that even at the modest scale that this experiment was done, it was more cost effective than business as usual. But at this scale, the cost was about $15 a month, right, is what it was. But at a scale of about 100,000 kids, this falls to $10 a year compared to 180. And at a scale of about 1 million, like, it falls to $2 a year. Right? So it scales really, really, really fast. This is $2 a year per kid, compared to in the pilot, it was about 180. So it'll almost fall by 100x, by a factor of 100, like at a reasonable scale. But that's like with any, like the marginal cost of a new, of a new Windows license is basically zero, right? So even that $2, half of that is Amazon cost for the server space for hosting the kids' data. Okay. All right? So that's why this is kind of so exciting. Now, one additional robustness thing which is useful, but I'm going to skip this. It's, again, so the program consists of 45 minutes on the platform and about 45 minutes of small group instruction with that adult I told you about. But again, if you compare this with that study I just told you about, it's clear that the adult per se is not doing any teaching. What the adult is doing is just giving you adherence to the platform, making sure that kids are not playing games and, like, doing other stuff. So it's not an instructional thing, but think about it as a blended kind of intervention. Okay, so the good news is that, like I said, these are some of the most exciting results I've seen. You get large gains for all subgroups over the full distribution of ability, and even for those who are the lowest tercile who are not making any progress. Like I said, these are likely to be an underestimate in terms of cost effectiveness. All right. So, but then this is all the good news, and then here's the problem. The problem is then you go to the policy side, and the only thing policymakers want to do is buy hardware. Okay, so, like, here is the state of Tamil Nadu, okay, right, like, and the recently deceased, like, chief minister, but highly, highly, highly popular, right, like, one of her signature programs is distribution of free laptops to girls in secondary school. You go up to the state of Uttar Pradesh, state of 200 million people, okay, on a standalone basis, the 5th largest country in the world. And what are they doing? Free laptops. And what is the learning impact going to be? Zero. Okay? So now the bad news, therefore, is, like, you can say that the political incentives are to do kind of what is visible, which is usually kind of procurement and hardware, because that's tangible. Okay? The good news is that given these jokers are spending on the hardware anyway, that sharply reduces the marginal cost, of deploying the software. Right? And so then the value of the research and the design is then incredibly leveraged because they're spending on this anyway. Okay? So to conclude, our next steps, like I said, is we think about this study as an efficacy trial, right, that demonstrates a proof of concept. It was implemented at a modest scale with high fidelity. So Scott, right? But that's the point you were making. It was implemented with high fidelity by motivated staff outside school settings at a small scale, right? Now, what happens when you take this to a more typical setting, right? And that's an open question. Okay, so just like in clinical trials, we see this as an efficacy trial that has demonstrated enough value that it's worth investing in the next level of testing and validation, right? So we plan to now in Rajasthan, we're kind of 90% of the way, to having the next phase of an RCT that'll happen over the next 2 or 3 years, where the idea is to deploy this in about 50 government schools, covering about 200 kids each, so a total of about, 10,000 kids over the next 2 or 3 years. All right? And yeah, we're in conversations with multiple states, but I think Rajasthan is the one that's most likely, okay? And like I said, the good news is given the pre-existing investment in computers, the marginal cost of this is very low and the political demand for computers is high. And so overall, finally, after 15 years of marketing of technology, I finally feel that there might be enough promise here that I'm excited enough to invest a substantial amount of time, trying to get this right at the next stage, okay? So since it's a design, so everything here is my first and the last slides are the only thing I changed for this audience, right? The first slide's telling you about economists as designers. And the next one is kind of what is the role for better design? Okay? So there's an incredible number of interesting design problems here, which I have no competence to solve. Okay? And the most basic of these is like, how do you optimally re-engineer a classroom, right? Like, I mean, given the possibilities of technology, right? So one view is people say, oh, does this mean teachers are obsolete because the computers will do the teaching? Okay? And that, I'm pretty sure, is not true. And there's this very nice paper by Otter, Levy, and Murnane in the QJE, which is one of the top economics journals, in 2004. And what they show is they look at kind of gazillions of jobs and job codes and look at the evolution of jobs over the kind of the co-evolution of jobs along with technology. Right? And the basic insight is very obvious to any of you who's in CS, is that functions that can be codified and written down in an algorithm, like I mean, will essentially be taken over by technology. But functions that are complements that require contextually aware communications, like I mean, are things where the computer increases productivity, so that's a complement. So then that's where you get the skill bias technical change, and you get the returns to education kind of being highly complementary with your ability to use technology. Right? So education is kind of your classic task of contextually aware communication. The entire point is I can teach you stuff in teacher training, but every classroom of 25 kids is different, right? And it's not just about the levels of the kids, it's about how they interact with each other, right? So nobody is going to computerize that function of education, okay? But what we do need is like a really nuanced redesign of the classroom, right? Where you basically do a time and motion study and saying, here is exactly how every minute of classroom time is being spent. Or here is how every minute of a teacher's work week is being spent. Which are the functions that can be routinized, where you can improve productivity with technology, right? So for all of us as faculty members, the thing we hate the most is grading, right? Like, I mean, it's the most kind of time intensive part of the job. There's no reason why that should not be done by technology.
You already have TAs.
Well, I mean, but I'm also valuing TA time, like, I mean, I want them to be doing their research as well, right? But yes, but the broader point is like, if you just kind of decompose the value chain of every single thing a teacher does, like, I mean, and kind of bring a technology lens to this and saying what parts can be automated and therefore sped up with productivity, and then how do you pivot teacher time towards tasks where, in economist language, we'd say they have a comparative advantage. Okay, so if you look at the latest research on kind of labor market returns to education, what we're starting to see is, in fact, the returns to pure STEM skills is actually falling, right? Because a lot of standard STEM is also algorithmable. But the returns to social skills are actually going up, right? Because the returns come not just from knowing the technology, but being able to communicate, like, I mean, and function in teams. Right? So then if you think about mapping what the teacher does to what the research is showing of where the returns are, then you could substantially improve productivity in education, but I don't know who's working on that problem. Now, there may be people, but the problem, and I think why this is such a fertile space for like really smart young folks to come into, is because there's no market test, right? There isn't necessarily a market incentive, like, I mean, you're not going to be the next like Google or Uber, like, I mean, from cracking the classroom design problem, right? Because the nature of procurement and public procurement is that it's just a mess. So you don't have a clean market test. So what I want kind of smart young people to be doing is not just thinking about the design, but then think about rapid evaluation protocols. Right? And then where there will be synergies between people thinking about design and people working on the evaluation side is I have no comparative advantage in trawling the design space, right? So my students and the kind of training we give them is about evaluation. But the synergies, like, I mean, would come from people who are interested in design intrinsically and then want to combine that with evaluation. And then there's a second big part, like, which I'm super excited about. Okay, so this is a whole new kind of research agenda of mine. It's almost, I think, in my more hubristic moments, I think we're creating a new field, right? Which is when you go look at the research on education in the past 25, 30 years. So I have written these 2 big handbook chapters of 100 pages each. Now, what you see is that even though I'm biased as an economist, even the non-economists will admit this, okay? That the methodologically highest quality work in terms of what we've understood about program effectiveness has been done by economists. Okay, that's because the disciplinary training is the strongest. But the weakness is therefore, as economists, we end up studying questions of interest to economists. So we study incentives, we study choice, we study information, we study competition, but we don't study pedagogy. right? Whereas like the lowest hanging fruit in terms of improving education, is going to come from how do you teach better, okay? And so last year, I had these kind of interesting faculty offers at some of the top education schools in the country, and I considered this very seriously, mainly for a research program of bringing experimental methods into pedagogy research, right? And because the problem is the people who are doing pedagogy are kind of essentially developmental psychologists or people who have experience developing curricula and testing in very small samples, right? But the testing, so I have a postdoc now just working on this extensive lit review. It's a scandal, right? You'll have studies with samples of 100 kids, 3 schools, 4 schools, that are sometimes the best we have on kind of research and effective pedagogy, right? So in a way, education research is a bit like where medicine was in the 20s, right? There's a lot of stories, right? But there's very little, validation of those ideas in representative samples with experimental methods with comparable outcomes, where the outcomes have not been developed by the curriculum designer themselves. So there's like a whole new discipline to be created. Okay, so what we're doing as part of this scale up, right? So there's kind of 2 parallel parts of this agenda, right? So one is we're working with public school systems to kind of build these Mindspark labs and kind of evaluate the impact of the current platform over 2 or 3 years. But the second is I'm building what's called a learning lab, right, where we have an additional grant to sit on top of this, where I now have a couple of postdocs from the top education schools in the country, working with me to say, how do we take ideas that the pedagogical people think make sense, but bring this into the setting and run high-frequency A/B tests, right? Because now on this platform, we get to do micro-experiments, right? So let's say we just want to know how to teach fractions, right? So you've got 100 kids, they're all on the platform. Here's 4 hypothesized way of teaching fractions. Let's run a high-frequency experiment, and within 2 weeks, we'll know what works. Right, so in the beginning, this style of work may generate 8 theoretical facts. So there's 2 ways to approach this agenda. One is to trawl, the existing literature and saying, here are the deep theoretical arguments, and let's design our experiments to test that theory. But then the other side is going to be, let's establish a set of facts, and then build a theory from that. Okay, so we're going to need a bit of both of that. And where I think there's incredible scope, for people with computer science, is basically machine learning and big data to crawl the design space, right? Because I can do a high quality experimental evaluation of an intervention that somebody who understands the data or understands education says this is an intervention that makes sense, right? But going back to that example I gave you about understanding and categorizing misunderstanding, I have no competitive advantage in doing that. Right? So as UCSD starts building this new data sciences initiative, right? I think there's incredibly exciting work to be done, right? So these design questions are not my core competence. But if there's students and postdocs and people in this room, who are really interested about technology and education, right? Then here's a chance to kind of say, come work with me for a couple of years, on this learning lab, go to India, spend time with EI, right? Because working with me, they'll give us access to all this data, and trawl the design space and saying here's patterns that are showing up. And then that allows us to design experimental tests of whether this works or not. So thank you for the invitation and to kind of make this recruiting pitch. So I'm done.